So welcome to the second class of this course, which I have given the title, The Knowledge Industry. We are, of course, reading chapters from the Constitution of Knowledge, and I'm delighted to be joined today by the author of the Constitution of Knowledge, Jonathan Rauch, who is Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. Welcome, Jonathan.
I'm very happy to be here.
Wonderful, it's great to have you. So, those following the course we're reading chapters 3 and 4 for today. We're going to begin with Booting Reality, the Rise of Networked Knowledge, chapter 3 there. And I'm going to sort of skip through the first couple of sections of this chapter, and then we're going to say a bit more about the fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh sections of this chapter. So the chapter begins with a sort of untitled section, and here you discuss Hobbes and Rousseau, but more importantly, perhaps, the group we have come to class as liberals, who, in your view, had the keys to the future in this period. In the section which follows on from that, the three liberal orders, we learn all about economic, political, and epistemic liberalism. And John flags up the importance of constitutions, written or unwritten, and the analogies between them in this section. John, if I can start out with an easy question. I don't know about you, but I love easy questions when I'm the one fielding the questions. How quickly or suddenly did the idea of family resemblance between these three constitutions evolve?
I'm not sure what you mean by how quickly. Do you mean in my mind or in the world?
Yes. In your mind, I mean, how quickly or perhaps suddenly did the idea that this kind of thesis take shape?
Well, I don't remember how quickly it was. I remember when it was, which is in the late 80s and early 1990s, when I set about writing a book called Kindly Inquisitors, the New Attacks on Free Thought, which sounds like a polemical book, but really is an effort to argue that there are three big liberal branches, and not just the two that we always talk about, which is liberal democracy and capitalism, free markets, but that there is a third epistemic branch, which is more important than the other two, actually, and which, like the other two, has extremely important political ramifications and needs to be defended politically. And that was what I call liberal science, which is our global system for establishing truth.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you for that. And in the section bearing the title Locke's Political Revolution, we learn about Locke's three contributions to political liberalism. And those are natural rights and rule by consent and tolerance. I mean, your iteration of these three different strands of liberalism is absolutely wonderful. And had we all the time in the world, I would want to speak about political liberalism and economic liberalism and your articulations of them. But my idea is to focus more on the epistemic liberalism, seeing as that's really what the central thrust of your book is about. To my mind, the Locke's epistemic revolution, that section there, begins a really important stretch of your book. It covers, I think, about 4 different sections, and you provide a sort of potted history of the evolution of epistemology in those different sections. And I'd like to sort of descend into detail a little bit here. One way of sort of framing this particular stretch of the book, John, it made me think a little bit about the way in which knowledge was organized before the epistemic revolution that you are talking about here, Bacon sort of set up the categories of knowledge in a particular way, didn't he? He had this idea that knowledge could be divided into divine philosophy, natural philosophy, and human philosophy. And what we get over the next few sections of your book is an account of the process whereby that sort of understanding of knowledge was pushed to the side a bit, and science emerges out of natural philosophy. Does that sort of compute with how you perceive your thesis?
Yes, science broadly defined, not just the hard sciences, but the whole process that we rely on today to try to come ever closer to truth emerges on two tracks at once. One is theoretical, and I trace that to John Locke, who of course is also the theoretical founder of political liberalism. The other was the work of actual practitioners who were creating the processes and procedures on the ground, and they were working in tandem and in conversation with each other to construct a liberal system for discovering and affirming truth.
Hmm. Super. Yes. Um, the just going to sort of for 5 or maybe even 10 minutes about this part of your book, John. You'll see that on this slide and on the next slide we have a kind of staircase to climb. It's a sort of visualization of what you take us through in the
I love it.
in this yes in this part, this important part of the book. Common threads that well, we're going to sort of like I'm going to focus on the section of the book where you more or less begin with Montaigne and go all the way forwards in time to Peirce. And there's a common thread running through this part of the book, which is connected to the idea that knowledge seeking is a sort of social enterprise. And I'm going to turn to that common thread when I've climbed all of these stairs, as it were. But as I sort of rehearse for the people following this course what it is that you say here, I'm going to focus on the common thread of empiricism in the first place. So if I can begin with Bacon, and I'll say something about Montaigne later. You cite Bacon's Novum Organum, honing in on the part where Bacon emphasizes the importance of observations and experiments. You say, knowledge comes from what truth seekers do, make observations and perform experiments which eliminate wrong answers and point us toward right ones. You reference empiricism here when speaking of Bacon. You turn to Joseph Ben David, and with his help, the book fleshes out the fact that Bacon's procedure involves sticking to empirically verified facts. Climbing up the stairs, empiricism is also crucial when you turn to Locke. Part of Locke's contribution is to insist that much of what passed for knowledge in his time, for example, broad generalizations and abstract axioms, were beyond the limits of what can be addressed empirically. The empirical realm is the area where we, and I quote, investigate the world and compare notes with each other. Continuing to connect with Locke, you then say, if our claims or hypotheses cannot be reduced to particulars and then checked against the experience and reason of ourselves and others, they are outside the boundaries of what we call science. The next step on the staircase, the staircase at the top of which we have the constitution of knowledge. The next step on the staircase takes us on to fallibilism. This step is perhaps shared by Charles Sanders Peirce, who also has a step also himself, and Karl Popper. You introduce fallibilism by speaking of Peirce for the first time in the book, and you say, and I quote, in the 19th century, skepticism, the idea that if certainty is impossible, knowledge must be impossible, was elbowed aside by a related but quite different idea, that of fallibilism, a term coined by Peirce. Now, clarifying the nature of fallibilism by referencing empiricism, starting to look forward to the contribution of Popper, you then say, For the fallibilist, the job is rather to search for error. We may not ever be able to achieve final confirmation of any empirical proposition, but we can achieve disconfirmation. You then direct our attention to the logic of scientific discovery, Popper, and you tell us that in that study, Popper posited that science may think of itself as looking for proof or at least verification, but in fact, its method is to seek falsification. And we can proceed to the next little step, the next set of steps, as it were. Turning to Peirce, you again speak of empiricism, but reaching for the nub of what Peirce argues, you start to emphasize Peirce's conviction that first and foremost, scientist is part of a community. And I quote, "We must go out and check our claims in ways which ought to satisfy any reasonable person, including complete strangers whose attitude is disinterested or even skeptical." The next step is bound up with the geologist James Hutton. You have a sense that, unbeknown to Hutton himself, he made two extremely important contributions to epistemology. The first, methodological. He insisted that no miracles were needed or even allowed in explaining the creation of the world. Observable natural forces had to suffice. And then a substantive contribution. The world must be extremely ancient, its origin no longer even discernible through the shroud of time. So these different steps, it seems to me you're going to come in with some corrections, no doubt, in just a moment. But if I can just complete this little disquisition of this part of the book, there is this second common thread in what you say, and we have another slide about that, and it's to do with the social nature of truth seeking, and you suggest that in a sense it's always been there. At least in terms of where your sort of potted history starts, even all the way back to with Montaigne, who you think realized that truth is a social problem. Speaking of Bacon, you refer to the implicit social promise of his method, Locke's empiricism as a social principle, and of course you advance this idea that Peirce's idea is that truth seekers they exist on a sort of a social network. So as well as empiricism being a kind of common thread running through this potted history, we've also got this idea that the social nature of truth is something of a common thread as well. Now, I have a question that I want to ask you about all of this, John, but perhaps I should allow you to come in and make corrections or suggest that maybe the emphases should be in different places. But over to you.
I think that was an admirable summary.
Thank you very much. In that case, I'll just proceed to the question then. So, reading, sort of as we go up these different steps, perhaps it's interesting to reflect upon who is describing and who is prescribing here, because it seems to me that perhaps Bacon is engaging in not just sort of describing, but prescribing, and his prescriptions are incredibly important with respect to just how much impact what he said had. At the same time, if we turn to Peirce, I think you suggest that his genius and contribution is rather unrecognized. So is he sort of describing something that was already happening without his advocating for anything in particular? So again, who's describing and who is prescribing across this history of epistemology?
Well, both are happening at once, and I don't really know how to sort them out because a lot of the people who were doing this work were working researchers and scientists, people like, William James, the American pragmatist and a working scientist. So I don't know how to disentangle those things, and I'm not sure it's important to do so.
Mm.
It's important for us as analysts
Yes.
to understand what was going on, and it's helpful in that respect to see that one track is theory as people gradually come to a theoretical understanding of what they think it is that they're doing.
Yes.
But also at the same time, it's important to look at what they actually are doing and see how the two things interact. The very big picture here behind all of this is that from the very emergence of the human species, we have had a terrible social problem, which is how to come to some kind of consensus on a public account of truth, things that we really have to care about as a group. And that might be, what God do we worship in order to make it rain? Um, and these things are very divisive, and they cause a lot of war and a lot of friction, a lot of schism, many deaths in most of human history. We're what, 200,000 years old as a species, and for the first until about 500 years ago, we did a very, very poor job of assembling knowledge across societies and time. And what happens in this period is both the practitioners and the theorists realize that we've been doing a very poor job. They look at the world and see, instead of an orderly process that's seeking to discover, confirm, and disconfirm ideas, they're seeing a lot of warfare. They've come off of 150 years of brutal warfare, wars of religion in Europe. They think there must be a better way, and they begin to assemble it. And
Mm.
that's what they're doing here. They're saying, look, we need an orderly process in which people are forced to turn to each other to confirm their beliefs, and we'll have what amounts to a reasonable person standard. And Peirce, way ahead of his times, looks at what's happening. This is in the late 19th century when you're getting the very birth of the research university at Harvard and Johns Hopkins and a few others. And he looks at this and he says, what I see here is the assembly of a network of minds that are focused on looking for evidence and counter evidence of propositions, and that the whole is, like any network, greater than the sum of the parts. So no one person can know more than a tiny fraction of what's on the network, yet it can cohere in a way that drives knowledge forward. So that to me is the big picture of the story that we're telling here.
Yeah. So there's both description and prescription. So Peirce is describing and but also prescribing. He's also advocating for what he sees around him.
Yes. And he's warning that the alternative, by the way, is war and death. He says,
Mm.
in most of history, nothing has sufficed better to settle a disagreement, a public disagreement, than a general massacre of all who disagree.
Hmm. Hmm. Very interesting. Um, so I'm going to continue to proceed, to skip through these different sections that are going at a fair clip, so as we can cover everything in these two chapters. We've already arrived at the globalization of knowledge. I like the quotation that I think you can see to the right of the screen there from your book. When I read this, it reminded me of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and that's of course because Victor is absolutely fascinated by chemistry, but he explicitly refers to chemistry as a branch of natural philosophy, and so modern science and natural philosophy haven't really separated themselves out in Victor's time, and it's a similar thing that you're speaking about with Hutton and so on here. Um, but this particular section, the globalization of knowledge, it's about the process whereby the knowledge-seeking community kind of exploded and became a truly global industry in the 19th and 20th centuries. Um, you celebrate the success of the burgeoning of science here. But I wanted to ask you about the humanities and social sciences and how they're doing. They deserve, the same kind of laurels as the scientific communities and magazines and networks that you talk about in this particular chapter. I thought it might be fun to share with you a quotation from one of Thomas Frank's books, fellow American, and he argues there's a number of disciplines in the humanities and social sciences. He feels that they find it hard to shake off orthodox thinking. You can see what he says here. Every academic discipline with which I have some experience is similar. International relations, political science, cultural studies, even American history. None of them are as outrageous as economics, it is true, but each of them is dominated by some convention or ideology. Those who succeed in a professional discipline are those who best absorb and apply its master narrative. The question, Jonathan, is, are the humanities and social sciences pulling their weight?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Uh, Mr. Frank here is being provocative. He's being a bad boy. And taken literally, he is quite wrong. Economics, for example, has taught us a huge amount about the world over the past 150 years. It's taught us all the ways, for example, in which a philosopher like Karl Marx was wrong. It's taught us principles like comparative advantage, which holds up very well. It's taught us a great deal about how to stabilize an economy, for example, how to run a monetary policy. And it is certainly true that social sciences, like all human endeavors, are subjects to fashions and fads, make mistakes, go down blind alleys, and alas, they can be politicized. And in later chapters of the book, which you'll get to, I worry a great deal about the politicization of science, broadly defined. That said, there have been breakthroughs in fields like psychology and political science and international relations. All of the things he names here have seen fantastic gains over the past 50 to 100 years. And I think it's absurd to suggest otherwise.
I'm going to ask you a question which I was going to ask you during the second half of this talk, but I think it's time to turn to this now. It's about economics. My question is, when a person advocates a particular economic program, are they not actually outside of the reality-based community at that point? Because we get arguments from left and right about what the best economic policies are for, say, the domestic economy at particular times. But when we move from is to ought, are we not leaving the reality-based community?
Well, it depends what you mean by moving from is to ought. If we're talking about factual matters, how much did the economy grow?
Yeah.
Then the answer is no, we have not moved beyond those things. If we're talking about theoretical matters, such as why do economies grow, then we're talking about areas which remain in many cases open and disputed, but are still well within the boundaries of scientific thinking. You know, we have empirical standards which we try to apply, we try to test, we try to use reason in order to understand, for example, whether modern monetary theory, as it's called, a new idea, is true or false. If we're simply in the realm of making political choices based on values, which do I think is more important, cutting spending or raising taxes, then yes, then we're in the realm of policy preferences, and then we're into the political process. And economics hands, or should at least hand the matter over to the political process and say, here are the facts and the theories as best we understand them. Now go off and decide. At least that's what's supposed to happen. In practice, do these things mix? Sure, of course. Everything is messy in real life.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Before we get to the big three, knowledge, freedom, and peace, in the ultimate social network, you emphasize the point about the reality-based community being a social network. You offer a compelling account of the full meaning of what it means to say that the advance of knowledge is networked. Then we have you and I are more biased than we are, which is, I think it's fair to say, is about the presence of error in scientific endeavor. How ideally error gets discovered, it gets dealt with in a civil way, again, ideally, and how science doesn't lose its bona fides because sometimes for a time, errors are defended by scientists. For the next, I want to just ask you a question relating to the final section of this third chapter, the big three: knowledge, freedom, and peace. I was struck reading the book, John, by the fact that I sort of expected you to sort of look backwards in time when it came to sort of evaluating the success of the, uh, the, uh, the constitution of knowledge. But I noticed that you revert to the modal verb should when speaking about the standards by which we should judge it. So is this deliberate? I mean, do you prefer not to look back over the past couple of centuries with respect to the performance of the Constitution, or would you be prepared to sort of to also look backwards and defend its achievements?
Well, I think I do look backwards some. I think
Mm,
in a couple of places in the book, I at least sketch some of the science indicators
mhm,
that have tracked over time the growth of the epistemic network. Things like the numbers of universities, their growth, and the numbers, for example, of publications, scholarly journals, how they are increasingly internationalized, the numbers of international collaborations. I think some of that is in the book
mhm,
by way of establishing the extraordinarily rapid, in fact, geometrical, not arithmetic growth of the knowledge network. And I think, or at least hope that I mention, that one of the great developments in this network today is the onboarding of huge amounts of new talent coming from developing nations, places like Africa and the Middle East, which have been off the network for a long time, to a large extent, are now coming in and coming in a big way, especially Asia. So I do a bit of looking back. I hope in this book that I don't have to start from scratch in establishing that modern science is on the whole a good thing, and that we would rather, for example, have medical care than not.
mhm,
But what I try to emphasize is not sort of the realm of technological achievement, but the three things that you've got on the screen right now.
mhm,
Those are the three major metrics and the three areas in which I do argue that the constitution of knowledge has been just extraordinarily successful.
mhm. Another question which comes to mind when I look at these three public goods. Well, you actually make references to how the Constitution of Knowledge helped with the peace, and of course, we know, of course, that its purpose is primarily to bring knowledge into existence. Perhaps the one which needs a little more commentary is the idea of freedom. What does it mean to actually suggest that this epistemic regime, sort of supplies or leads to a sort of an expansion of human freedom?
So when you've got a system that is dedicated to coming ever closer to truth, objective knowledge, as we call it, not quite the same thing as truth, but it'll do for now. When you've got a system that does that by hunting for error, it means that you have got to allow people to make mistakes. You've got to allow people to have disagreement, because when everyone agrees, we don't find our mistakes because no one is challenging our assumptions. And it means that people need to have the freedom to point out other people's mistakes, no matter who those people are. The core of this system are two principles. One is fallibilist, which says anyone can be wrong at any time, including the leaders, for example, of the society. And the second is empirical, which says everybody has to be checked by everybody else.
Yes.
And you only have knowledge to the extent to which those things stand up. And when you have those rules, you have, as we've discussed, rules that create the principles on which you can build a global knowledge-seeking network of everyone checking each other and applying empirical methods to consult and compare. But you also have a system which has built-in retardants against any particular political interests or social interests saying, I'm in charge now, the rest of you shut up.
Hmm.
The argument is over. You can't do that. It's against the rules.
Yeah.
Even the highest and mightiest need to subject themselves to checking, and that means you've got freedom wired in. And that is not true of any other or any previous epistemic system, and amounts to a breakthrough in human affairs.
So, chapter 4, and we're going to get to fallibilism and empiricism in just a moment, of course. Those being key ideas in this chapter. Just a couple of observations about some of the earlier sections here. So we have again a sort of untitled section at the start, and that first section plus the second one, the genius of compromise, represent your celebration of Madison as a political liberal, and how important the idea of compromise is to his liberalism. In the next section, what reality really is, you argue that members of the reality-based community, and I quote, think of reality as a set of propositions or claims or statements which have been validated in some way and which have thereby been shown to be at least conditionally true. And then in that third section, rules for reality, you turn to the same two core rules that you spoke about in Kindly Inquisitors, the fallibilist rule and the empirical rule. And let's just pause to discuss this for a moment. Again, rereading your book before meeting you this time, John, I really like the section where you speak about these kind of constitution busting rhetorical moves that we sometimes come across, and also on how the two rules prohibit them. So it's almost as if one can sort of arm oneself, if that's not too militaristic a metaphor, with one can equip oneself with these two rules, and one should be able to deal with, again, what you call rhetorical moves on the part of interlocutors. Could you rehearse that point just a little bit for us? You have in mind things like, sort of a plea to one's identity, for example, and you go through the manner in which these two rules prohibit a number of rhetorical moves, a number of ways in which one can proceed in an argument. And reading your book this time, I found that quite a suggestive section. Is this, I mean, do you see these two rules as rules that an academic should equip themselves with in order, to before sort of engaging in dialectic with opponents?
Yes. I mentioned a moment ago, I alluded to these two rules and their political implications, which are profoundly anti-authoritarian. But what they also do is require cooperation. They require people to turn to each other to validate what they think is true.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, they require people to turn to complete strangers, people who have very different points of view. If something is a true statement, then it ought to be able to be validated by someone in, I don't know, Iran speaking Farsi, or someone in Africa speaking Urdu. It should be true everywhere. And that rule, that empirical rule, combined with the rule that anyone can be wrong at any time, makes it very difficult for people who would want to do special pleading to do so. These would be people who say, because of who I am, you should believe me and not someone else, or because of who I am, I deserve special standing in this debate. So some of the things that you hear frequently today, for example, as a gay man, which I am, or as a Jew, as I am, I can say, and you should not dispute. You can't do that.
Yes.
So a lot of the ways in which knowledge seeking gets sidetracked are blocked, or at least made much more difficult by this way of doing things.
Yes. Yes. I think of this chapter as being this centerpiece of your book, but but perhaps this section in which you discuss these two rules, is it not the centerpiece of the centerpiece? I mean, of course, we're going to go on to speak about assenting attitudes and commitments and sort of academic virtues which parallel Republican virtues. But beyond this point, there's a lot which is not rules. There's a lot more to do with human behavior. So, in terms of a constitution which could be written down, I mean, is this not really the absolute center of that constitution?
Yes, yes. This is the center of that constitution, and these two rules go back to my first work on the subject, Kindly Inquisitors, previously alluded to, and they're published now, what, 31 years ago. I made the pretty bold and presumptuous claim that wherever you see these two rules practiced, wherever you see them put into effect, you will see something that looks very much like modern science. And that these are the only two things that you really need to create the ground conditions for the modern epistemic system. What I did not do in the earlier book, and which the rest of this chapter turns to, is I did not flesh out the institutional arrangements and rules that are necessary to put on top of the fallibilist rule and the empirical rule. To use an analogy, the kind of master analogy for this book, these two rules are kind of like the Declaration of Independence. They are the broad principles that lay out the kind of republic that we want to have. But it turns out that's not enough. You need a constitution. You need a much more elaborate system of norms and institutions which guide us from day to day in how we apply these other two rules. And that's what the rest of the chapter tries to establish.
Wonderful. Well, let's move forwards then. Most of the questions I want to ask you now, John, relates to the final three sections of this chapter, and so I would like to provide a sense of what the sections beginning with the marketplace of persuasion are about. I mean, I'd like to provide our students with a sense of what each of these different sections deal with. So in the marketplace of persuasion, you return to Jonathan Haidt's insight that, like the denizens of Madison Avenue in the 60s and subsequent decades, we are persuaders. But now you suggest that the reality-based community also benefits from that desire, from the desire to persuade that we possess. So we arrive at this idea of a marketplace of persuasion. I guess it means that you sort of mix your metaphors in the book. On the one hand, we have a constitution of knowledge. On the other hand, a marketplace of persuasion. A social funnel rehearses I think you could say, the typical life of an idea, how it begins in an inclusive, welcoming environment, but must overcome progressively difficult hurdles, which in most cases leads to a thesis getting rejected. In how to organize everything, you raise the issue of how capacious or how limited the realm of liberal science is, and you opt for a sense that it's a large domain accommodating aesthetic and moral facts as well as empirical ones. And you arrive at the conclusion that liberal science, I'm quoting, liberal science is characterized by orderly, decentralized, and impersonal social adjudication. In scholarship, journalism, government law, you argue that the Constitution is not simply the code governing research. It also represents the modus operandi in the judicial system, government agencies, and journalism, of course. So moving on to the common cores, I'll just change slide for us. You say here that the professionals and the sectors of the reality-based community sign up to certain commitments, and we can see them down the right-hand side there. Looking at this list now, John, I mean, do you think that any of these are especially difficult to respect, or what sort of comments? Yes,
they're all very difficult to respect. Before saying that, I'll just add a minor, but to me, significant addendum to your admirable exposition of the previous portion. I do use a number of metaphors in the book, but the constitution of knowledge is not a metaphor. I maintain that it is an actual thing. Now, it is not a written constitution like the US Constitution. It is an unwritten constitution like the British Constitution. But it is an actual thing. It exists. It is principles and rules and institutions which embody very specific norms and procedures, which those in its framework commit to upholding. And they are written down in lots of different places. For example, the American Society of News Editors Codes of Conduct, the American Association of University Professors Red Book, which is on academic freedom and standards, and so forth and so on. So the constitution of knowledge is really there. It's not a simile, a figure of speech, a metaphor, or anything like that. So the common cores, they're all very difficult.
Yeah.
And that's part of why this system is at once quite robust and also quite fragile. But this is where the previous 3 chapters of the book all come together. We established in chapter 1 that there are attacks on truth, on our ability and mechanisms to seek objective knowledge. In chapter 2, we established that actually, left to our own devices, human beings, both individually and socially, are very cognitively impaired. We're driven by all kinds of biases, and individually we can't do anything about it. And that's the epistemic state of nature, and it's a big problem. In chapter 3, we look at how if you don't have a system, a public system for deciding what's truth, you wind up in chaos and warfare and ignorance, and how some people went about changing that. And all of that sets us up to say, okay, look, we've got this fundamental problem. How can we see reality correctly when we're also biased? How can we come to conclusions when we're also different? And the answer is, you do these things, you follow these rules. But because they go against our biases, they can all be very difficult. You know, fallibilism, just to pick the first one, we don't like to think we could be wrong about anything. We like to think we're right about everything. So the idea that we can be challenged at any point by any person around the world, that doesn't come easily. You can go all the way down this list and see the same thing. You can pick out civility, for example, and look at the world online, and you understand that civility can be quite hard to maintain. But, you know, when you or I write an academic paper, it's not going to begin calling the person on the other side of the issue an ignorant slut. It's going to begin with a respectful review of the literature. Even if you don't like that person, you have to pretend to get along with them. And that's very important for advancing knowledge. So all of these things are difficult.
Then moving on to converging constitutions. On converging constitutions, you again rehearse the parallels between the 2 constitutions. And I'm honing in on what you call the Republican virtues of the Republic of Science. I wonder, and again, I'm tempted just to ask a similar kind of question, but perhaps we'll approach it in a different kind of way. Could you divide these? Could you divide the virtues of the Republic of Science into theological and cardinal virtues? Of course, in the Catholic Church, the theological virtues are the bedrock or foundation for all the other ones. and the sort of the cardinal virtues, they can only be built on top of the theological virtues. Is there any sense in which is there any kind of hierarchy here in terms of these the virtues of the Republic of Science? Can you see anything of that sort?
I don't know that there's really a hierarchy. There's different emphases at different moments. When I look at the quotation here, I see that it ends, above all, we need to accede to the unique sovereignty of critical persuasion in establishing knowledge, and we accept no shortcuts. And if there is a single most important principle, it's analogous to the most important principle of the United States Constitution, the principle that Lincoln established so forcefully in the 1860s, and alas, very bloodily, but that's the sovereignty of the Constitution, that it governs us all. And people say we live in a democracy in America, the people are sovereign. That's not quite right. The Constitution is sovereign in America. It limits what even the people can do.
Mm-hmm.
And the same is true of the Constitution of Knowledge.
Yes.
At the end of the day, if you want to make knowledge, there are a lot of things that you need to do and some things that you need to not do. But the most important thing you need to do to be part of that club, to be part of the reality-based community, you've got to accept the sovereignty of the Constitution of Knowledge, which means understanding that you may be wrong, and that you can't control the debate and you can't do all these other things that we've been talking about that are bad.
Yeah. And just to be absolutely clear then, the commitments which we just sort of looked through a moment ago, and then these virtues, the commitments and virtues, it's only a matter of if you want to be a member of the reality-based community, then these commitments and virtues are relevant. But if you don't want to be a member of the reality-based community, if you're not a scientist or a journalist or a judge, maybe you're a politician, for example. These commitments and virtues are for members of the club. Is that fair?
Yes, though I think politicians should generally be truthful. I will accept that they are not in the truth-seeking business per se. But that's right. Again, we can go back to the parallel with the US Constitution. So the US Constitution is for settling particular kinds of disputes in the public sphere. It's about making law and public policy. It is not about, for example, the dinner table. We don't have a First Amendment so that you can appeal to the government about what someone can and cannot say at the dinner table. If it's my house, I'm entitled to say, we are not going to discuss politics at Thanksgiving, and I can do that. The government can't. In much the same way that the US Constitution preserves liberty by bounding itself, by saying that the Constitution does not apply to all of society, it applies to this part. The Constitution of Knowledge is a framework for researchers like academics and journalists and government officials and lawyers and some others, people in places like museums and libraries, who are in the knowledge-making business, and it's the rules for how they go about that business. But they don't need to do the same thing in church, because you don't go to church to do experiments to see if some new bacterium will be effective in fighting some disease. You go to church for other things.
Yes.
And one of the great innovations of the Constitution of Knowledge is that it does not try to intrude itself on every aspect of life. It does not say you can't be spiritual in your church or in your synagogue or walking around on the street. It just says, if you want to add to the canon of knowledge, if you want what you think is true to be confirmed and put in textbooks and taught, then there are these specific things you have to do, and they're listed on the slide.
Excellent. So commitments, virtues, but also assenting attitudes. And the interesting thing here is that we definitely move outside of the reality-based community. We move into the wider society. But that's a scary sort of move, isn't it? Because it's not simply about how scientists behave or treat each other. It's about public perception of science and so on. And so where are we with respect to these assenting attitudes? Obviously, I can certainly see how a crisis narrative could be advanced here. Um, are you satisfied that these assenting attitudes are common in wider society? Where have you where would you land now in May 2024?
I am concerned, and
Hmm.
the remaining chapters of the book explain the reasons why I'm concerned. In the academic world, we see a politicization of science in many fields. We see a lack of the kind of viewpoint diversity which is necessary to drive the error-seeking process forward. We see in many cases the stifling, especially self-censorship of views which are seen as unorthodox, as heterodox, as incorrect. All of those things worry me. And in the broader political context, especially from the MAGA right, we see the use of Russian-style mass disinformation and other forms of propaganda that are designed to undercut the conditions that are required to have a constitution of knowledge. The idea that there is such a thing as truth, or that truth matters, or that the truth is not just the claims being made by left-wing elites for their own purposes, harnessed to wide-scale efforts to deceive and disorient the public.
Hmm.
Now, I should say that the constitution of knowledge has been controversial from day one, and it always will be because it's so deeply counterintuitive. You remember in that previous slide, we discussed how all of the norms and behaviors it requires are difficult and counterintuitive and push us against our natural grain. So there will always be challenges and threats to this constitutional order, just as there are to the political constitutional order, which means we can never lose our watchfulness. We need to get up every morning for the rest of time, and so will our kids and their kids and all subsequent generations, and continue to make the case for these values and norms from scratch. Free speech, for example, the idea that government should not only allow but actively protect speech which is obnoxious or hateful or wrong-headed or blasphemous. To human beings, that just seems intuitively like a crazy concept. The only thing it has going for it is that it is the most socially successful concept in all of human history. It's allowed freedom and truth and knowledge and peace. So that's I think where we are, understanding the constitution of knowledge and protecting it.
And just perhaps the last question about this section. Perhaps the public's perception of the scientific community has been influenced quite a lot by obviously the COVID pandemic and the rolling out of vaccines and so on. I mean, and you can only really speak to the situation in the United States, I'm sure. But do you feel that these assenting attitudes have been impacted on positively or negatively by the whole COVID era?
Well, there's certainly been issues around COVID and so forth. Public confidence in science per se, the hard sciences, chemistry, medicine, biology, that kind of thing, remains actually pretty high. But public attitudes toward institutions and experts generally are doing very badly and have been steadily declining over time. And that's as a result partly of very specific attacks from the left and the right. The left, we've had a postmodern movement which says expertise is just a mask for oppression by dominant groups and classes. And from the right, you've had an attack that says expertise is just a bunch of left-wing woke elites trying to tell you what to do. And that has diminished the intellectual capital of the reality-based communities in ways that are going to affect us in very real ways. For example, if we corrupt our legal institutions, then it's going to be much harder to have fair verdicts in trials. And that's being tested right now in a very prominent trial in New York City.
Thank you for that. John, this is the first time I've taught one of these courses. The launching of course, this idea of a liberal bookshelf course. I'm so happy you were prepared to join me for this second course. I thought that a feature of these courses might be that when I meet the author of the course book, I recommend a book to them. And so I'd like to, one of the last things I want to do is actually recommend a book to you.
I'd love that.
Yeah, and the idea is, I read your book and then I think, well, what might this author enjoy? Which hopefully they haven't read. Otherwise, the suggestion won't sound very clever. But Mark Thompson, he used to run the BBC, and then he moved to the New York Times Company, and now he's at CNN. And he published a book a couple of years ago called Enough Said. And it's on my liberal bookshelf. I think it's a remarkable volume. Why do I think that it might be enjoyable for you to read it? It's because I think it's the best book which explains the community that politicians live in. It's a book about public speaking, public language, and it's about, I guess, how politicians should speak in public, and when they get it right, when they get it wrong, what is the exact nature of it. I think we've sort of touched upon the fact that politicians, they're not really like scientists or even journalists. I don't think they may have one foot in the reality-based community, but their position in society is a bit more complex than that. And to my mind, Mark Thompson's book about the community that politicians live in and how they should speak and how they shouldn't speak, to me, it's the best book about that subject. So I would recommend it to you.
Well, thank you. I will certainly track it down.
And for the benefit of those following the course, then I'll just show this final slide. And of course, these are the titles of chapters 5 and 6, which you're reading for next time. And what wonderful chapters they are. So much to get your teeth into there. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm incredibly grateful, as is the Institute for Liberal Values.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted that you are taking the time to teach my book and to do it so conscientiously.
Thank you very much. That's all for this week then. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.